When the excavator's blade struck something metallic beneath the barren earth of the old Nishida farm, nobody expected what would emerge from that California soil. Not the construction crew, not the property developers, not the town that had spent 3 decades pretending Taro Nishida didn't exist. What they unearthed that October morning in 1982 wasn't just buried treasure. It was a mirror reflecting the ugliest truth a community could face about itself. And before we dive into this story that will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, dignity, and the price of hatred, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and whether your town has monuments to its mistakes or just tries to forget them. This isn't just another story about hidden gold or small-town prejudice. This is about a man who became a ghost in his own home, who wore invisibility like armor, and who spent 30 years orchestrating the most devastating act of grace in American history, a final testament that would crack open the conscience of an entire community and force them to confront the monster they'd become. What makes Taro Nishida's story extraordinary isn't just what he hid beneath his land, but what he revealed about the human capacity for both cruelty and transformation. Taro Nishida returned to Salinas Valley in the spring of 1946, though returned isn't quite the right word when you come back to a place that's done everything possible to erase you. He was 42 years old, rail-thin from 3 years behind the barbed wire of Manzanar internment camp, carrying a single battered suitcase containing everything the United States government hadn't seized, sold, or destroyed. His farm, 80 acres of some of the richest agricultural land in California, paid for with 2 decades of dawn-to-midnight labor, had been managed by the county during his imprisonment. Managed in this case meant stripped of equipment, depleted of nutrients, and offered for sale at auction. Prices to the very neighbors who'd cheered when the buses took Japanese families away. But Taro had learned something in those camps. Something forged in the desert heat and the humiliation of armed guards watching you shower. True power lives in the space between what others demand and what you refuse to surrender. He reclaimed his land through legal channels that shocked everyone who'd assumed he'd never come back, who'd already divided his property in their minds like wolves over a fallen deer. And then he did something that first seemed like defeat, then looked like stubbornness, and finally appeared to be madness. He stayed. He stayed and farmed 70 of his 80 acres with a discipline that bordered on supernatural, while that final 10 acres near the old oak grove lay fallow, untouched, forbidden. The town called him the Ghost Farmer because he moved through Salinas like vapor, present but unseeable, there but unacknowledged. He bought his supplies at dawn before other customers arrived. He sold his produce through intermediaries. He attended no town meetings, no church services, no harvest festivals. His English, once impeccable from his education at UC Berkeley before the war, became halting and broken, a tactical retreat into the stereotype they needed him to be. Let them think him simple, diminished, beaten. Let them underestimate everything. But Taro's true genius was in what he did with every dollar that farm produced. He lived in a house that looked like it might collapse. And it might have, except that Taro was a master carpenter who knew exactly which beams to reinforce while letting the facade decay. He wore clothes that goodwill would have rejected. He drove a truck held together with wire and prayer. And every witness to his poverty felt vindicated, felt confirmed in their judgment that this is what happens when you challenge America. When you come back where you're not wanted. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that beneath that carefully cultivated image of destitution, Taro Nishida was executing a financial operation of such precision and patience that it would take 3 decades to complete. The antagonists in Taro's story weren't simple villains. They were a constellation of American prejudice, each representing a different flavor of the hatred that had stolen 4 years of Japanese American lives and tried to steal their futures too. There was Richard Calloway, the property developer, who'd been 13 when Pearl Harbor was attacked and 47 when he started his campaign to acquire the Nishida land. Calloway represented the businessman's bigotry, wrapped in euphemisms about highest and best use and community development, seeing in Taro's farm not a man's legacy but a parking lot for the strip mall he wanted to build. Then there was Margaret Chen, and yes, the irony of an Asian surname wasn't lost on anyone, though her family had been in California since the gold rush and she'd spent her entire life proving she wasn't that kind of Asian. Margaret sat on the town council and spoke in the civic meetings about property values and neighborhood character whenever Taro's name came up, which was usually when someone suggested finally inviting him to the annual Memorial Day ceremony. She represented the insider's prejudice, the minority who'd made it by pushing others down. The younger generation had Danny Breslin, a hothead in his 20s who'd grown up on stories about Pearl Harbor from his grandfather, and had never bothered to learn the difference between Japanese soldiers and Japanese-American farmers. Danny represented ignorant hatred, the kind that doesn't need personal grievance, just permission from the culture around it. He'd drive by Taro's farm on Friday nights with his friends, shouting slurs, throwing beer bottles, once even trying to run over Taro's mailbox. And then there was the crowd, the collective antagonist, the townspeople, who simply went along with the exclusion because it was easier than standing against it. The shop owners who hung "No Japs" signs in 1942 and simply never took them down. The church that never sent an invitation. The neighbors who'd wave at each other across Taro's property line as if his land was empty space, a void in the landscape. The confrontations began small and accumulated like stones in a wall of rejection. There was the morning in 1951 when Taro went to First Valley Bank to apply for a loan to replace his aging tractor. The loan officer, Thomas Wickham, had processed paperwork with professional efficiency until he saw the name on the application. "Mr. Nishida," Wickham had said, drawing out each syllable with theatrical distaste. "I'm afraid your application doesn't meet our current lending criteria." Taro sat in the chair across from Wickham's desk, his calloused farmer's hands folded in his lap, and asked in that deliberately broken English he'd adopted, "What criteria I not meet?" Wickham had smiled, the kind of smile that contains no warmth, only the satisfaction of having power over someone powerless. "Multiple criteria, Mr. Nishida. Multiple criteria. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable seeking lending from institutions that specialize in high-risk borrowers." The room, a small-town bank lobby where everyone knew everyone's business, had gone silent. Other customers had turned to watch, and Taro felt their eyes like weights. But he didn't stand up. He didn't leave. He sat there for exactly 7 seconds, a pregnant pause that made Wickham visibly uncomfortable, before saying, "I see. I understand. Thank you for your time." And then he'd stood with such dignity, such careful deliberation, that somehow Wickham looked smaller sitting behind his big desk with his rejection power. In 1959, the town council held a public hearing about rezoning agricultural land for commercial development. Margaret Chen had stood at the podium with charts and graphs, never saying Taro's name but making it abundantly clear which 80 acres she believed should be rezoned. "We have property in this district," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular pitch of righteous civic concern. "That is underutilized, that produces minimal tax revenue, that represents frankly a blight on our community's progress. The owner refuses to modernize, refuses to participate in community planning, refuses to even attend these meetings to defend his outdated practices." Taro had been there that night, sitting in the back row, a ghost at his own trial. When the time came for public comment, he'd stood, and the room had actually gasped, so unaccustomed were they to his presence in civic spaces. He'd walked to the podium with slow, measured steps, his worn boots echoing in the chamber. "I am Taro Nishida," he'd said. And his English suddenly wasn't broken at all. It was precise, educated, each word a small detonation. "My land is not blight. My land feeds people. My land has fed people since 1925, before many of you were born. I understand you see parking lot. I see earth that remembers my father's hands, my mother's prayers. I see earth that will outlast all of us." He'd paused then, looking directly at Margaret Chen. "Even you, councilwoman, who forgot where you came from so you could sit where you sit." Then he'd returned to his seat, and the rezoning proposal had failed by 1 vote. Not because the council suddenly developed principles, but because Taro had reminded them there were still a few old-timers who remembered when his farm produced a third of the valley's lettuce. The confrontations escalated through the 60s and 70s. There was the incident where Danny Breslin and his friends tried to burn Taro's barn, and Taro had caught them in the act, not with violence but with a garden hose and a calm voice saying, "Fire is hungry. Fire does not care about politics. Fire would eat your homes too." Danny had expected rage, maybe fear. The calm certainty of Taro's voice had been more unsettling than any threat. There was the year the county tried to condemn 10 acres of Taro's land for public use, that pristine, untouched 10 acres near the oak grove. And Taro had fought it with lawyers he somehow afforded despite his apparent poverty, fought it all the way to state court, and won. Through it all, Taro maintained his ghost-like existence, never explaining himself, never justifying, never seeking anyone's approval or understanding. He farmed his 70 acres with a precision that bordered on art. He paid his taxes on time, every time. He broke no laws, caused no problems, asked for nothing. And the town interpreted his quiet dignity as either stubbornness or simplicity, never recognizing it for what it was. A man playing a long game with stakes none of them could see. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that every dollar Taro saved from that farm went into a specific plan. He bought gold coins, American eagles, mostly sometimes old double eagles from before the war. He bought them one at a time, through mail-order dealers and estate sales, never enough at once to draw attention. And he buried them in mason jars beneath that 10 acres of untouched land, sealing each jar with wax and wrapping them in oilcloth, creating a treasure that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with memory, with justice, with the most extraordinary act of grace imaginable. By 1982, Taro was 78 years old. The cancer had been eating him for 2 years, though he'd told no one, sought no treatment. He'd lived the life he chose and he would die the same way. In September of that year, he drafted a will with a lawyer from San Francisco, not anyone in Salinas who might talk, who might leak his final instructions. And on October 3rd, 1982, Taro Nishida died alone in his farmhouse, found 3 days later by a postal worker who'd noticed the mail piling up. The town's reaction was everything you'd expect, a sort of guilty relief. He was gone. The problem was solved. Richard Calloway immediately contacted the county about purchasing the property through the estate. Margaret Chen suggested they finally rezone it. Danny Breslin, now 40 years old with 3 kids and no more wisdom than he'd had at 20, told his friends they should have burned that barn when they had the chance. The will stipulated that the property would go to the newly formed Japanese American Citizens League chapter in Salinas, a chapter that didn't exist yet because there weren't enough Japanese Americans left in the valley to form one. But the will also contained specific instructions. Before transferring the property, the executor must excavate the 10 acres near the oak grove, following a map Taro had provided, and distribute what was found according to his wishes. On October 18th, the excavation began. It was supposed to be simple. Verify the land was clear, maybe find some old farming equipment, satisfy the legal requirement, transfer the deed. The construction crew hit the first mason jar 18 inches down, just after sunrise. By noon, they'd found 47 jars. By sunset, the count was at 212. And when they finally stopped digging 3 days later, they'd unearthed 476 jars containing over 14,000 gold coins worth approximately $4.3 million in 1982 dollars. But the treasure itself wasn't the revelation. It was what else they found. Buried with it. In a waterproof case at the center of the excavation site, they discovered 37 years of documents. Letters to every family from Salinas who'd been interned, tracking their whereabouts, their struggles, their children. Deeds to properties that had been stolen and sold, researched and documented. Receipts for anonymous donations to struggling families. Families who'd assumed the money came from the church or civic organizations, never knowing it came from the ghost farmer they shunned. And a final letter, written in Taro's precise handwriting, explaining everything. "My name is Taro Nishida," the letter began. "And I am what you made me when you stole 4 years of my life and tried to steal my dignity too. I am the ghost you created. The invisible man you needed me to be so you could sleep at night. But ghosts see things living people miss. Ghosts move through walls you think are solid. And ghosts remember everything. This gold represents 37 years of my labor, every dollar I saved beyond what I needed to survive. I could have left, gone to a city where nobody knew my face or my history. I could have lived in comfort, retired in peace. But I stayed because this valley is soaked in the blood and sweat of my parents, my people, everyone you tried to erase. I stayed because someone had to remember. And I saved, because I knew someday you would have to face what you did. This fortune will establish the Salinas Valley Japanese American History Center, built on this land you tried to steal. Every name of every family you imprisoned will be carved in stone at its entrance. Every story you tried to bury will be told in its halls. Your children and grandchildren will learn what you did, and they will have to decide what kind of people they want to be. But more than that, because I am not interested in vengeance, only in truth, this fortune will also fund scholarships for the children of Salinas, all children, because hate is something we teach and therefore something we can choose not to teach. It will fund a community center where people of all backgrounds can gather because isolation feeds fear and fear feeds hatred. To Richard Calloway, you wanted this land for profit. Now it will profit the community you tried to exclude me from. To Margaret Chen, you forgot your people to join theirs. I hope this reminds you that running from your identity only means you arrive nowhere. To Danny Breslin, you threw bottles at my mailbox and called me the enemy. Your children will learn in the center built with my labor that the only enemy is ignorance, and that I forgive you for yours. To everyone who crossed the street to avoid me, who served me last at the store, who pretended I didn't exist, I saw you, all of you, and I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because hatred is a poison I refuse to die holding. You took 4 years of my life in a camp. I will not give you one more day by carrying rage. I leave you this gold and this burden, to finally see me, to finally acknowledge what you did, and to choose differently. That is the only revenge worth taking, to make you better than you were. The revelation hit Salinas like a seismic event. The local newspaper published Taro's letter in full on the front page. Television crews arrived from San Francisco and Los Angeles. What had been a story about buried treasure became a story about buried conscience. Richard Calloway read the letter in his office and, according to his secretary, he sat at his desk for 2 hours afterward, not moving, not speaking. When he finally emerged, he was crying. This 54-year-old businessman who'd spent years trying to pave over a man's legacy. At the public memorial service the town hastily organized, Calloway stood at the podium and said, "I saw profit where there was poetry. I saw inconvenience where there was integrity. Taro Nishida tried to teach us for 37 years, and we were too arrogant to be students. I spent decades trying to take his land. I will spend whatever years I have left trying to deserve the grace he's shown us." And he did. Calloway became the primary fundraiser for the History Center, donating both money and land, ensuring the project exceeded every vision. Margaret Chen didn't speak publicly for 3 weeks after the discovery. When she finally addressed the town council, she submitted her resignation, saying only, "I don't deserve to represent a community I betrayed by." Forgetting where representation begins, with recognizing everyone's humanity, especially those whose humanity threatens our comfort. She went on to earn a PhD in Asian American Studies and spent the rest of her career documenting the stories of internment survivors, becoming one of the most important historians of the Japanese American experience. Danny Breslin showed up at the excavation site the day after the discovery and asked if he could help. The crew foreman, not knowing who he was, handed him a shovel. Danny worked there for free for 2 weeks, digging up the treasure of a man he'd tormented. On the last day, he broke down, sobbing into the same earth that held Taro's sacrifice. His children attended the grand opening of the History Center, and Danny made them read every name on the memorial wall, made them understand what their father had been and what their grandfather had taught him to be. But the most profound transformation happened in the collective, in the town that had to look at itself through Taro's eyes. The No Japs signs came down overnight, though their shadows remained on the walls like scars. The church that never invited him dedicated a memorial garden in his honor. First Valley Bank, under new management, established a loan program specifically for minority farmers and named it the Taro Nishida Opportunity Fund. The postal worker who found his body, a woman named Susan, led a campaign to rename the street where his farm stood Nishida Lane. The History Center opened in 1985 on the very ground where Taro had lived and died as a ghost. It stands today as a monument not just to Japanese American internment, but to the cost of hatred and the power of grace. In its entrance, above the names of all the families imprisoned, carved in stone, are Taro's final words, "Hatred is a poison I refuse to die holding." The scholarships have sent over 800 local children to college in the 40 years since. The community center hosts ESL classes, cultural exchanges, conflict resolution workshops. A town that tried to erase one man was forced to rebuild itself around his memory. But here's what the news crews missed, what the documentaries never quite captured. Taro Nishida didn't win because he had gold buried in his fields. He won because he understood something that his enemies didn't. That true wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you give away. That real power isn't control over others, it's control over yourself. That the ultimate victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's transforming them into people who can no longer be your enemies because they've learned to see you as human. For 37 years, Taro lived as a ghost, so that his truth could live forever. He wore poverty like camouflage, used silence as strategy, and turned every rejection into another gold coin buried with purpose. He didn't just survive his enemies, he saved them from themselves. And in doing so, he proved that the greatest form of resistance isn't violence or vengeance, but the refusal to let hatred define you and the courage to let grace be your final word. So before you click away, before you move on to the next story, ask yourself this. What would you bury for 37 years so that truth could emerge when you're gone? What price would you pay to teach a lesson that outlives you? And when someone treats you as invisible, can you turn that invisibility into power rather than powerlessness? If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think differently about what strength looks like, hit that like button. Drop a comment sharing a story of grace you've witnessed, because we need more of these stories, more reminders that the human capacity for change is as real as our capacity for cruelty. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story of people who chose dignity over defeat, who turned their wounds into wisdom. And share this with someone who needs to remember that the long game of justice, played with patience and grace, always wins in the end. Because Taro Nishida's farm is gone now, replaced by the History Center. But his lesson remains, growing in soil he cultivated with suffering and watered with forgiveness. That the treasure we leave behind isn't what we accumulate for ourselves, but what we sacrifice so others can become better than they were.